Billionaire CEO's wedding ruined. As triplets cry out, "She heard us." Guests stunned. The church doors flew open with a deafening slam. Gasps echoed as three small girls, identical, trembling, stood frozen beneath the grand arch. Their worn dresses clung to their thin shoulders, eyes wide but unflinching. "He heard us," the oldest whispered, voice shaking but steady. All eyes turned to the bride. Vivien's fingers tightened around the bouquet. A flicker of panic danced behind her polished smile. Caleb Mercer, the billionaire groom, stared at the children, then at the woman he was about to marry. "And after our father died," the second girl spoke, her voice breaking, "she left us on the street." The sanctuary fell silent. Caleb's world cracked. And in that moment, as the weight of unsaid truths filled the air, everything he thought he knew about love shattered. The Manhattan skyline glowed behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, as if the entire city was holding its breath with him. Caleb Mercer stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie for the fifth time. The silk slipped through his fingers like water, steady hands betraying a rare tremble. Not from fear, not from regret, from the overwhelming weight of something he'd never thought possible. Peace. For years, the world saw him as the impenetrable billionaire, a man who built his tech empire from nothing but sharp instincts and colder calculations. He was the CEO who never made mistakes, who never wavered, who never loved. Until her, Vivien Lake. Even now, her name stirred something quiet and dangerous inside him. She wasn't like the others, not the models at charity galas or the corporate heiresses who smiled too wide. Vivien carried herself with grace that never begged to be noticed, with confidence that came from something deeper than wealth. She chose him. That was what disarmed him most. 6 months ago, their worlds collided by accident, or fate. A hotel bar, a simple martini. A shared glance across crowded silence. She had dropped her phone at his feet, smiled as he returned it, and with one effortless moment, she'd slipped into his life as though she belonged there all along. From that night forward, it was easy. Effortless dinners, evenings spent wrapped in conversation, not contracts. No negotiations, no power plays, just breath. He'd built empires by controlling every variable. But with Vivien, control had never been necessary. In weeks, she met his closest friends. Sandra, his protective assistant, had even whispered, "Who's different, boss? Don't let this one go." He didn't intend to. The proposal had come fast, yes, but not impulsive. Not for a man who never moved without certainty. They'd planned the wedding quietly. 200 guests, no spectacle, only people who mattered. A modest church instead of a gilded ballroom. No tabloid headlines, no paparazzi. Just them. And now, standing at the altar, he watched as the grand doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open. There she was. Vivien glided forward, draped in white silk that shimmered beneath the stained glass light. No veil, no borrowed traditions, only her understated elegance. Her eyes locked on his, and the world stilled. This was right. Every sacrifice, every cold night spent alone, every deal closed at the cost of something softer, it had all led here. To this perfect moment. But perfection, he would learn, carries its own price. Because what Caleb Mercer didn't know, as Vivien reached for him, was that fate had invited 3 small ghosts to the wedding. And the truth, brutal and relentless, was about to rip through his carefully built world. Chapter 1. The Wedding That Never Happened. The organ swelled, filling the sanctuary with a sound that felt larger than the room itself. Guests rose from their pews in synchronized silence, eyes turning toward the grand wooden doors as they swung open, slow and deliberate. Vivien Lake stood at the threshold of forever. Her silk gown shimmered in the golden rays pouring through the stained glass, catching the light like fragile fire. Every step she took seemed designed, poised, practiced, perfect. The bouquet of white lilies rested gently in her hands, and her lips curved into that subtle smile she always reserved for Caleb, alone. Their eyes locked across the distance. Caleb Mercer exhaled softly, feeling his chest tighten beneath his tailored jacket. In that moment, he thought of nothing but her. Not the board meetings, not the acquisitions, not the billions stacked under his name. Only her. This was the woman who had thawed a man the world thought unbreakable. Mark, his best man, leaned in slightly, whispering under his breath, "Here comes the woman who finally made the great Caleb Mercer surrender." Caleb didn't respond. His throat tightened too much for words. Vivien's steps were slow but confident, not rushed, not hesitant, as if every part of her knew exactly where she belonged. And for the past 6 months, that was by his side. She had slid into his world like sunlight through a crack, gentle but impossible to ignore. The church was filled with all the right faces, his board members, close friends, trusted partners, people who had seen him climb from a nameless graduate into one of the youngest billionaire CEOs on the East Coast. They nodded approvingly as Vivien approached. She had won them over easily. Her charm, subtle, never desperate. Sophistication was stitched into her very bones. 2 steps from the altar, she paused, as though soaking in the moment. She looked at him, eyes gleaming emerald beneath the vaulted ceiling, and smiled again, that smile that had undone him from the very start. It promised stability, understanding, a kind of quiet permanence he never dared believe possible. The pastor opened his book and spoke with reverence. "Dear friends, we are gathered here today." The doors slammed open again. The sound ricocheted like thunder through the ancient church. Gasps rippled from the guests as heads snapped toward the intrusion. Standing in the doorway were 3 children. Identical, small, pale. Triplets. Their worn clothing clung to their thin frames, shoes scuffed and mismatched. But it wasn't their appearance that seized the air. It was their eyes, wide, fixed, steady. They stared ahead with a seriousness far too heavy for their tiny shoulders. The sanctuary fell into suffocating silence. One of the girls, the one standing slightly in front, stepped forward, voice thin but cutting. "She heard us." The words floated through the church like shards of broken glass. Caleb's pulse stalled. His gaze flicked instinctively to Vivien, expecting confusion or alarm. Instead, for a single breathless moment, he saw something else. Fear. Not the kind born from misunderstanding, but recognition. It passed so quickly he might have questioned if it was real, but something deep in his chest whispered that it was. Vivien recovered almost instantly, schooling her expression into one of tight annoyance. She leaned toward him, whispering under the veil of her controlled smile, "Caleb, can we get someone to escort them out? They must have wandered in." But before he could respond, another girl stepped forward. "And after our father died," her voice cracked but pressed forward, "she left us on the street." A chill ran down Caleb's spine. The air around him thickened, his ears ringing beneath the weight of those words. The guests fidgeted uncomfortably. Some whispered, others simply stared, unsure whether they were witnessing a scene from a bad dream or a scandal unfolding before their eyes. Caleb found his voice, steady but low. "Vivien, do you know these children?" "Of course not." Her answer was instant, sharp. "I've never seen them before in my life." But Caleb's mind spun. The timing, the certainty in the girls' voices, the sheer audacity of walking into a billionaire's wedding? It didn't fit as random. The third girl now spoke, her words deliberate. "You married our father, Thomas Whitlow." The name sliced through Caleb like cold steel. Thomas Whitlow. A name he had never heard before. He searched Vivien's face again, begging silently for an explanation. Denial, outrage, confusion, any sign of innocence. But her expression was locked tight, carefully measured. Her voice sharpened. "That's ridiculous. I have no idea who they are. Someone clearly coached them." The pastor, unsure how to proceed, closed his book gently. Mark took a step closer to Caleb, his hand lightly resting on his shoulder as if steadying him. The triplets stood rooted in place, silent now but unflinching. Their very presence accused her more loudly than any words could. "Vivien," Caleb whispered again, his voice lower, more desperate. "Are you sure you've never seen them?" Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she forced her jaw firm. "Absolutely sure." She faced the congregation now. This is a cruel stunt by someone who doesn't want us happy, someone jealous, maybe a rival of yours?" The words sounded logical, familiar even. He had dealt with plenty of business enemies capable of using children for leverage. And yet, "I'm Nora," the first girl interrupted, locking eyes with him. "These are my sisters, June and Mira. We're triplets, daughters of Thomas Whitlow." The sanctuary erupted into faint gasps and murmurs again, the tension now thick enough to cut. Caleb's entire body burned cold. And then Vivien made her final misstep. Her voice lifted, sharp and brittle. "You're seriously going to believe 3 street kids over me, after everything we've shared?" Her words, once so poised, now dripped with panic. The cracks were no longer subtle. Caleb stepped back slightly. The veil of certainty that once wrapped him began to unravel. He inhaled carefully. "I think we need to postpone the ceremony." The temperature of the room shifted instantly. Vivien's expression turned to ice. Her whisper cut like venom. "You'll regret this, Caleb Mercer. I wasted 6 months of my life on you." And with that, she turned sharply, storming down the aisle, her gown sweeping behind her like a shattered dream. As she reached the doors, she pivoted one last time. "They're lying, and you're a fool." The doors slammed shut behind her. The triplets stood still for a beat, their mission complete. Then, wordlessly, they turned and exited as well, disappearing into the city that had swallowed them once before. Caleb stood, frozen, as the weight of what had just transpired settled into his chest like wet cement. Mark stood quietly beside him. "I'm sorry, man." Sandra approached, her voice a soft thread in the chaos. "Caleb, are you all right?" He said nothing. He wasn't all right. Because at that moment, Caleb Mercer, one of the most powerful men in Manhattan, realized he had no idea who the woman he was about to marry truly was. But he was about to find out. Chapter 2. The First Seed of Doubt. 3 days had passed since the wedding that never was. 3 long, heavy days. The Manhattan skyline glittered beneath Caleb's penthouse windows, but for the first time in years, it offered no comfort. His world, once sharp, organized, and ruthlessly efficient, now felt foreign, as though everything solid had shifted beneath him. He sat in silence, nursing a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. The ice had long since melted. His phone buzzed beside him, flashing with a message he'd read too many times already. "I'm at the Royal Oaks, room 512. We need to talk, 3 p.m. Not a request, an appointment. Just like her. Effortlessly in control, still playing the part. The clock ticked closer to 3. Caleb stood, straightened his jacket, and exhaled a breath that did nothing to steady his pulse. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations, courtroom battles, and hostile takeovers with nerves of steel. But this felt different, because for the first time in his life, Caleb Mercer wasn't fighting a competitor. He was facing a woman he once believed he loved. The Royal Oaks Hotel stood tall and pristine, old-world elegance dressed in modern marble. He stepped into the lobby, every footstep muffled beneath thick Persian rugs. No cameras, no press. Just the weight of unanswered questions pressing against his chest. The elevator doors closed with a soft sigh. As he rose, so did the tension. Room 512. The door opened before he even knocked, as if she'd been standing right behind it, waiting. "Caleb?" Vivien greeted, her voice as smooth as always, her smile precise. She wore a charcoal gray suit this time, not the gown, not soft silk, business armor. No hug, no kiss, no attempt at warmth. "Please," she gestured, stepping aside. "Come in." The suite was spotless, sterile. An untouched tea service sat by the window. Her suitcase, perfectly zipped, leaned against the wall like it had never been opened. No signs of someone living there, only passing through. Like always, calculated. Caleb remained standing. Vivien sat, crossing her legs with graceful ease. "I thought you'd come sooner," she began, pouring herself a cup of tea. "I needed to think." "Of course," she nodded, perfectly composed. "What happened at the church was unfortunate?" "Unfortunate," his voice sharpened. 3 children stormed our wedding, Vivien." She exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "They were coached, obviously. Someone is targeting me. Us. You know how easily people are manipulated when money's involved. Caleb's jaw tightened. You're still insisting you don't know them. I told you already. Her voice didn't waver. I've never seen those children before in my life. But they knew your name, he pressed. They knew where the wedding was. They knew details most strangers wouldn't. Her lips curved into a sympathetic smile. Caleb, anyone could find that. Our engagement was public. The venue was printed in the paper. All it takes is a clever con artist. And the name they mentioned? Thomas Whitlow? Her smile faltered, only for a fraction of a second. I have no idea where they pulled that name from. Caleb studied her carefully, the perfect posture, the controlled breathing, no tremor in her voice. The same woman who had so easily slipped into his life, fitting like a missing puzzle piece. But this wasn't a missing piece. This was something far darker. You're remarkably calm for someone falsely accused, Caleb said softly. What do you want me to do? She countered, finally leaning forward. Fall apart? Cry? Scream? That's not who I am. You know that. He did. And yet, something gnawed at him. You haven't asked about them once. That gave her pause. The children, he clarified. You haven't asked where they went, who they are, how they're surviving. Nothing. Vivien's smile cooled. They aren't my concern, they're liars, Caleb. If I give them attention, it only feeds the narrative. He let the words hang in the air. For 6 months, he had watched this woman charm every room she entered. Every dinner, every gala, every meeting. She maneuvered like a master chess player. And yet, there had always been something missing beneath the perfection. Something he hadn't allowed himself to see until now. You're not curious at all, he asked, voice lower now. Not even a little? Vivien's voice turned colder. Curiosity gives them power. The distance between them had never felt wider. Caleb walked to the window, staring out at the city's glittering lights. He saw his reflection in the glass. Sharp suit, steady eyes. But behind it was a man who no longer trusted what he thought he knew. He turned back to face her. Tell me the truth, Vivien, right now. One last time. She met his stare directly. I have told you the truth. He inhaled slowly. If you're lying, I will find out. A flash of something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, but calculation, as if measuring her next move. Her voice softened. Caleb, I still love you. We can still have the life we planned. This can go away. Let's reschedule the wedding, privately, quietly. The audacity of it hit him like a slap. You want me to pretend none of this happened? She stood now, closing the distance between them with careful grace. You're a brilliant man, she whispered, reaching for his hand. We're both practical, you and I. We don't let emotion destroy opportunity. Caleb gently pulled his hand away. I'm not sure who you think I am, Vivien, but I'm not like you. The silence between them was thick. She took a step back, her voice sharpening again. Be careful, Caleb. You're about to throw away something very rare. No, he said calmly. I'm about to find the truth. And with that, he walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her standing in the perfect, empty hotel suite. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. The rain returned that night as if the city itself understood his mood. Caleb sat alone in his penthouse office, the lights of Manhattan blurring behind raindrops streaking down the glass. He didn't hear the storm, didn't feel the time slipping by. He was still seeing her face, composed, beautiful, terrifying in its emptiness. His phone buzzed beside him. It was Richard. Come up, Caleb answered without greeting. Minutes later, Richard Harrington stepped into the office, always precise, always steady. Exactly the kind of man Caleb needed in this moment. Coffee? Caleb offered, though neither of them reached for it. Richard sat, placing a slim leather folder on the desk. You wanted me to start digging. Caleb nodded once. Tell me everything. Richard opened the folder with care, as though afraid of what it might contain. I started where you asked. Thomas Whitlow. At first it looked like a dead end. No criminal record, no public scandal. He lived a very quiet life. Richard paused. He was a professor, English literature, taught at a small university outside the city. Respected, well-liked. Caleb's stomach tightened. Richard continued, voice even but deliberate. He married Helen Whitlow. They had triplets. Nora, June, and Mira. 8 years old now. The names hit Caleb harder than he expected, like confirmation of something he'd hoped was still some elaborate mistake. Richard flipped to another page. Helen passed away from cancer 3 years ago, 6 months after her death. He slid a document across the desk. Vivien Lake married Thomas Whitlow. Caleb stared at the certificate, his chest tightening with every word he read. There was her name, clear as day, in legal ink. A marriage he knew nothing about, a life she'd never mentioned. And children. 3 innocent lives she had hidden from him entirely. Richard spoke gently, watching him closely. 8 months ago, Thomas Whitlow died from heart failure, official cause. No suspicion of foul play. After that, things get murkier. Caleb looked up, his voice flat. The children? They vanished from the system. Caleb frowned. No official custody transfer, no formal adoption. But the house they lived in was sold 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral. Richard tapped the next sheet. Vivien handled the sale, closed it fast, moved to the city within days, started her consultancy business shortly after. Caleb's breath slowed. A carefully staged reinvention, a clean exit. And the girls? He asked again. There's no adoption record, no guardian registered, but... Richard exhaled. A neighbor filed a police report 2 days after the house sold. Claimed she saw the 3 girls sleeping on a park bench near the neighborhood. Caleb closed his eyes, anger and guilt swirling inside him like twin storms. The same children who had walked into his wedding. Alone. Abandoned. By the time police arrived, Richard continued, they were gone. No further sightings logged. The rain pounded harder against the glass, matching the rhythm of Caleb's pulse. She left them. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. She married their father, then discarded them like they were nothing. Richard nodded, his voice softer now. It appears that way. Caleb stood abruptly, unable to stay seated, walking toward the window as the lights of Manhattan smeared into blurred streaks before his eyes. I built my entire life on being able to read people, he said bitterly. And I didn't see any of it. She's very good at hiding, Richard offered. Masterful, actually. Caleb let out a breath, sharp and ragged. Anything else? Richard hesitated, flipping to the final few documents. There's a pattern, Caleb. His tone darkened. Before Thomas Whitlow, there was Martin Reynolds. Caleb turned, his gaze sharp. Another marriage, another widower. Martin died of natural causes. 6 months after they married, Richard's voice grew even quieter. She inherited a substantial sum from his estate. A cold, sickening realization slithered through Caleb's veins. And before that, Caleb pressed? Nothing concrete. That's as far as her trail reliably goes back. Everything before Martin is conveniently vague. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The rain was the only sound in the room. Finally, Caleb whispered, "Who is she?" Richard didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Caleb stared out the window again. Everything in him burned. Betrayal, fury, confusion, but beneath it all pulsed something heavier. The image of the triplets, Nora's quiet leadership, June's fierce anger, Mira's fragile, quiet strength. 3 children who risked everything to walk into that church and stop him from marrying the woman who destroyed their world. And he had nearly walked straight into it. I want to find them, Caleb said at last, voice low but steady. I want to know where they are. I want to hear their story. Richard nodded, already expecting the order. I'll put a full team on it. Discreet. Quiet. And Vivien? Caleb added. We'll watch her too. She won't know we're looking. Caleb nodded. Good. The 2 men stood, the weight of what lay ahead pressing on both their shoulders. As Richard left, Caleb remained in the darkened room, staring into the storm that now reflected the war inside him. He had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, crushed competitors with ruthless efficiency. But nothing prepared him for this battle. Because this time he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for 3 children who had already lost too much. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the rain and the glass, Caleb Mercer made a silent vow. I will find them. no matter what it takes. Chapter 4. The Ghosts of the Past. It was nearly midnight. The storm had eased, but Caleb's thoughts hadn't. His penthouse, usually a sanctuary of order and silence, now felt oppressive, the weight of unanswered questions pressing against every inch of air. The file Richard left lay open on his desk, a scattered map of betrayal. Marriage certificates, property transfers, death certificates. Each document was another nail driven into the truth Vivien had tried to bury. He traced his finger slowly over a photograph. It showed Thomas Whitlow standing in a sunlit backyard, his arm draped lovingly around Vivien's waist. The triplets, so much smaller then, stood in front, holding tiny bouquets of wildflowers, their matching smiles radiating an innocence now shattered. Any family? A family she discarded. Caleb's stomach twisted. He could almost hear Nora's voice from the church. She heard us. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He had been so blind. 6 months of perfect conversations. 6 months of dinners, of her slipping so easily into his world, never once stumbling over a single inconsistency. She had studied him, learned his weaknesses, anticipated his questions before he even asked them. It was a carefully constructed illusion, but there were always cracks. He could see them now. Small moments that seemed harmless at the time, but which, in retrospect, screamed to be noticed. It was during one of their first weekends away together at a private ski lodge. They were seated near the fireplace after a long day on the slopes, sharing a bottle of Pinot. "Do you want kids someday?" Caleb had asked casually, watching the flames dance. For a moment, Vivien had gone still, just barely, before smiling. "I'm not sure I have the maternal instinct," she had answered lightly. "But you? You'd make a wonderful father." He had smiled back then, flattered by her deflection, mistaking it for honesty. But now it struck him differently. Not a hesitation, but a calculated pivot. Avoiding, always avoiding. Another memory surfaced. A late dinner at her apartment, minimalist, spotless, almost sterile. "You don't keep photos?" he'd asked, glancing around at the pristine walls. "I prefer to live in the present," she'd replied smoothly, brushing off the observation with that quiet elegance she always wore like silk. But it wasn't preference, it was erasure. No evidence, no past. The weight of it all finally forced him to his feet. He paced the room like a man cornered, but by ghosts rather than enemies. The worst part wasn't that she lied. It was that he had wanted to believe her. Because deep down, Vivien was exactly who he thought he wanted. Self-sufficient, controlled, low drama, a partner who didn't ask for more than he could give. She had fit perfectly into his life. Not because she was perfect, but because she became what he needed. She had played him perfectly. But the triplets had broken that illusion in the span of 5 minutes. 3 small girls who weren't supposed to exist. Caleb's phone vibrated suddenly, snapping him from his spiral. A text from Richard. Lead surfaced Hamilton Square Park. Small vendor reported seeing 3 identical girls selling candy near fountain 2 days ago. Caleb read it twice, his pulse spiking. They were still nearby. He grabbed his coat, heart pounding, eyes burning from exhaustion but alive with new focus. No bodyguards, no driver. This he needed to do himself. Because this wasn't business. This was something else entirely. The streets were quieter now. Manhattan's usual roar had softened under the late hour, the rain slicking the asphalt like glass under the streetlights. He parked near Hamilton Square and stepped out, scanning the darkened park. It was mostly empty. Just scattered benches. A few late-night dog walkers. An old man feeding pigeons beneath a flickering lamppost. He walked slowly, eyes searching. The fountain stood at the park's center, ornate, still trickling water that caught the light in small, delicate sparks. And then he saw them. Huddled under a large oak tree off to the side, 3 small figures, sitting shoulder to shoulder on a worn wooden bench. Even in the dim light, their silhouettes were unmistakable. Triplets. Caleb paused, forcing his breath to slow. He couldn't approach them like a businessman. These were children who had every reason not to trust anyone, especially another adult connected to Vivien. He took slow steps forward, careful not to startle them. As he neared, one of them, the same girl who spoke first in the church, noticed him and nudged the others. All three turned toward him, eyes wide, their bodies tensing like small animals ready to run. He stopped a few feet away, lowering himself slightly to their eye level. "Hello," he said softly. "You remember me?" They didn't answer, but he saw it in their guarded stares. Recognition. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he continued gently. I was supposed to marry Vivien." Still silence. "I've been looking for you," he admitted. "I just wanted to talk, to listen." The girl in the middle, June, he recalled from the files, spoke first. "Waste. Because," Caleb swallowed, choosing his words carefully, "I think you've been through something nobody should ever go through. And you were brave enough to stop me from making a terrible mistake." The leader, Nora, studied him intently. "You're not with her anymore?" she asked quietly. Caleb shook his head. "No, I'm not." There was a long pause, the air between them charged with unsaid things. Finally, Mira, the smallest one, whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Are you here to take us away?" Caleb's throat tightened. "No," he promised. "Not unless you want me to." For the first time, their rigid shoulders eased ever so slightly. And in that fragile sliver of trust, the ghosts of the past began to step into the light. Tomorrow, he knew, they would finally tell their story. Chapter 5. The Search for the Girls. The cold night air settled around them, but Caleb barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the three small girls seated before him under the oak tree. Their eyes reflected the faint streetlights, identical, wary, far too old for 8-year-olds. He remained a respectful distance away, careful not to crowd them. Their small shoebox of chocolate sat between them. Lumpy, imperfect candies wrapped in crinkled foil. "You made these?" he asked softly, nodding toward the box. June gave a tiny nod. "Her mom taught us, before she got sick." Caleb lowered himself onto the edge of a nearby bench. The movement made them flinch for a brief second, but they stayed. "My assistant found a record of your mom, Helen. She sounds like she was wonderful." Mira's small hands twisted in her lap. She was. Nora's voice, steady and quiet, broke the tension. "You know everything, don't you?" "I know pieces," Caleb replied honestly. "But I want to hear it from you. Only if you want to tell me." The girls exchanged that silent language they seemed to share. A silent conversation in glances and small nods. After a beat, Nora spoke again. She came after Mom died. She said she was Dad's friend from college. Vivien. Caleb swallowed hard. He stayed silent, letting Nora speak at her own pace. "She brought us gifts at first," June added. "She was nice. She smiled a lot. But then after she married Dad, she stopped smiling." "She didn't like us much after that," Mira whispered. Her voice trembled but didn't break. Caleb clenched his fists in his pockets, the fury boiling beneath his calm exterior. "She got mad when we made noise," Nora continued. "If we laughed too loud or if Dad paid us too much attention, she'd punish us." "What did she do?" Caleb asked gently. Nora's eyes darkened, and June finished for her. "She'd lock us in the basement sometimes. She said she needed peace. She said we were distractions." Caleb's chest tightened. "And your father?" he asked. "Hilden didn't know," Nora said firmly. "She was nice when he was around, like a different person." Mira's eyes dropped to the floor, her voice barely audible. "He got sick, heart stuff. He went to the hospital a lot. Then, one day he didn't come back." The girls fell silent. Even after all they had endured, this wound was still fresh. "And after he passed?" Caleb asked softly. "He pretended to be sad at first," June said bitterly. "But as soon as everyone stopped coming by, she packed everything up." "She sold the house," Nora added. "She threw away our drawings, our toys, everything." Caleb felt a hollow ache in his stomach. "And then? Dawn day we came home from school and—" June's voice cracked for the first time. "The locks were changed. Our bags were on the porch." She opened a window. Mira added quietly, and said we weren't her problem anymore. Tears stung the corners of Caleb's eyes as he imagined 3 tiny girls sitting alone in the cold, waiting for a door that would never reopen. So we left, Nora said simply. How did you survive? Caleb asked, his throat tight. Nora lifted her chin slightly, her composure returning. We stayed nearby at first, then farther away. We learned which parks were safe. We sell chocolates. Sometimes nice people let us use their kitchens. And you never told anyone? Caleb asked. June answered, her voice sharp. Vivien said if we went to foster care, they'd separate us. That we'd never see each other again. Mira nodded silently beside her. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breathing. What kind of person weaponized fear like that against children? You stayed together, he said softly. You protected each other. Always, Nora whispered. The pride and resilience in her voice broke something inside him. And then you saw the wedding announcement? Caleb asked. June nodded. We saw it in an old newspaper. The bakery lady sometimes gives us papers to stay warm at night. When we saw her picture, Mira said softly, we knew we had to stop her. Before she did to you what she did to us. Caleb's throat burned. He couldn't speak for a moment. They hadn't come for revenge. They came to protect him. 3 children who owed him nothing had risked everything to save him. Thank you, he finally said, his voice rough, sincere. You saved me that day. The girls exchanged another one of their silent glances. The rain began again, soft at first. Caleb glanced at their thin jackets, at the worn shoes that barely covered their small feet. Where are you staying tonight? He asked gently. Nora hesitated. Under the bridge, Mira admitted quietly, before Nora could stop her. The rain picked up, heavier now, soaking into their thin layers. Come with me, Caleb said softly. I have a place for you to stay, just for tonight. It's warm, safe, no expectations, no strings. The 3 girls huddled together, their silent communication unfolding once more. Finally, Nora looked at him and gave the smallest nod. Just for tonight, she said firmly, until the rain stops. Caleb smiled softly. Just until the rain stops. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet. The girls sat in the back, their wide eyes scanning the glowing skyline. For Caleb, something shifted in those moments. This wasn't a rescue. This was the beginning of something far greater. Chapter 6. The house that finally felt like home. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing Caleb's penthouse. 6,000 square feet of glass, marble, and silence. But tonight the silence was different, less heavy, almost expectant. The girls stepped in cautiously, their eyes wide as they took in the towering windows, the city lights twinkling like scattered stars behind them. The apartment was pristine, organized, a world so far removed from the park benches and underpasses where they had survived for months. You live here? June asked softly, almost disbelieving. Caleb smiled gently. Yes. But tonight, it's your home too. They clutched each other's hands tightly, as if afraid that letting go might make it vanish. I know it's a lot, he added, sensing their hesitation. Take your time, nothing here will hurt you. Sandra had already been there earlier that evening, dropping off fresh clothes, toiletries, and enough groceries to last weeks. She hadn't asked questions, only smiled, and said, You're a good man, Caleb, a very good man. He turned to the girls, speaking softly, as if trying to soothe a frightened bird. Let's get you cleaned up first. The bathroom's just down the hall. There are towels in the cabinet, and I'll find you some clothes while you shower. Nora, the quiet leader, nodded once, her chin lifting as if accepting his offer on behalf of all 3. While they disappeared into the guest bathroom, Caleb moved swiftly. Sandra had thought of everything: soft pajamas, small toothbrushes, kid-sized slippers. He arranged it all neatly on the guest bed. The room itself was warm and spacious, with oversized windows that framed the rain-slicked city. The queen-sized bed looked enormous for 3 tiny bodies. When the girls emerged, hair damp, faces scrubbed clean, it was as if layers of exhaustion and fear had been gently peeled away. Their skin glowed under the warm light, revealing faint freckles and soft pink cheeks. Their thin frames were swimming in his oversized t-shirts for now, but they didn't seem to mind. The transformation was startling, not just in how they looked, but how they carried themselves. For the first time since he met them, Caleb saw children. Still cautious, still guarded. But children. In the kitchen, he had laid out a simple meal: grilled cheese, warm soup, and a tray of cookies that Sandra had insisted on. Mira's eyes lit up at the sight of the cookies. "You made all this?" she asked shyly. Caleb chuckled. "Sandra helped. I'm not much of a chef." June climbed into a chair first, followed by her sisters. They waited politely, unsure of how to begin. "You don't have to wait," Caleb said softly. "Help yourselves." It was small, this dinner, this room, but something in it felt enormous. The sound of spoons tapping, of small giggles slipping out between bites, filled the apartment like music he hadn't known he was missing. During the meal, the girls started to talk. Slowly at first, like testing the temperature of unfamiliar water. June spoke about their chocolate-making process, explaining how they bartered with the bakery lady to use her kitchen at night. Nora asked questions about Caleb's company. "You build computers?" she asked curiously. "Sort of," he smiled. "We build programs that help businesses run better." Mira, who had been the quietest, piped up unexpectedly. "Do you work all day?" Caleb paused. "I used to," he admitted. "But lately, I think I've been working too much." "That's not good," Mira said, shaking her head with sudden confidence. "You should rest, too." Caleb's chest tightened unexpectedly at her concern. "You're right," he whispered, almost to himself. After dinner, the girls migrated to the living room, their bare feet padding across the polished floors. Caleb put on a simple animated movie, nothing too stimulating, just enough to ease the weight of the day. He watched them from the kitchen as they huddled together under a blanket on the large couch. Even with the city stretched endlessly behind them, they seemed small, almost lost in the oversized world he lived in. Yet something about their presence filled the empty space like nothing else ever had. Later, as the hour grew late, he showed them to the guest bedroom. The girls climbed onto the big bed, immediately pulling the comforter around them like a protective shell. But Caleb noticed they all stayed close, their bodies instinctively touching, as if the fear of separation still lingered, even in the safety of warm sheets. "I can pull out the sofa bed," Caleb offered gently. Nora shook her head firmly. "We sleep better together." He nodded, understanding. "That's perfectly fine." He dimmed the lights, leaving the door cracked open. "If you need anything at all, I'm just down the hall. Don't be afraid to wake me." They nodded together. "Good night, Nora." "June." "Mira," he whispered. "Good night, Caleb," they said softly in unison. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching them settle, breathing slower, faces relaxing into sleep. Later that night, as Caleb passed by the guest room one final time, he saw the three of them curled up under the blankets, their identical faces finally at peace. For months, they had lived as survivors, not children. Tonight, they simply slept. Caleb leaned against the wall, his heart heavy but full. He hadn't intended to become their rescuer. But tonight, for the first time, his house, once cold, precise, and orderly, felt like something else entirely. It felt like home. Chapter 7. Vivien's Last Visit. It had been 7 days since Caleb brought the girls into his penthouse. 7 days of small victories. Laughter at breakfast. Nora organizing books in his library. June insisting on helping with dinner, and Mira's quiet hums as she drew with colored pencils Sandra had brought. It was temporary, he reminded himself, just until the legal team found a solution. But with every passing day, Caleb felt something stronger building inside him, a strange, unfamiliar warmth that scared him far more than any corporate negotiation ever had. That morning, the girls were still asleep when the doorbell rang. Caleb glanced at the clock. 8:17 a.m. Too early for deliveries. Too early for anyone. His stomach tightened as he crossed the living room and approached the front door. He checked the security camera out of habit. There she was. Vivien, dressed immaculately in a pale blue dress, her waves of dark hair falling perfectly around her shoulders. She looked as if the past week hadn't existed, as if she were still the woman he'd nearly married. The woman who had nearly stolen everything. Caleb hesitated before opening the door. "This isn't a good time," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Vivien's lips curved into the familiar, patient smile she always wore when she wanted to disarm him. "Please, Caleb, 5 minutes. That's all I ask." He exhaled, his jaw tight. 5 minutes. Inside, she glanced around as if expecting the penthouse to look different. Her eyes paused briefly on a child's drawing pinned to the fridge. A rainbow, signed by Mira. She said nothing. Caleb didn't offer her a seat. "I tried calling you," she began smoothly. "You've ignored every message." There wasn't anything left to say. Vivien's tone shifted instantly, lacing her voice with a soft vulnerability. "I know you're angry. I understand that. But Caleb, you have to believe me. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen." "You're right," he cut in sharply. "It was supposed to be our wedding, and instead 3 children walked in and exposed everything you hid from me." Vivien inhaled slowly, schooling her features. "I panicked. I should have told you about Thomas. About the girls. I made a mistake." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "A mistake? You married a man, helped raise his children, and after he died you threw those children onto the street. That's not a mistake, Vivien. That's cruelty." Her carefully composed mask began to slip. "Caleb," she tried again, stepping forward, lowering her voice into a plea. "Please, we can still fix this, you and me. We can start over." He stepped back. "Start over?" Vivien's eyes glistened as she reached for his hand. "I love you, you know that." He looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. "You don't love anyone, Vivien. You manipulate, you calculate, and you discard people when they become inconvenient." Her smile vanished. For the first time since he'd known her, her face hardened. "Those children were never mine," she hissed, the softness falling away like a shattered facade. "They were his burden, not mine." Caleb's breath caught. "Their children. They were never my responsibility," Vivien snapped, her voice rising. "I did what I had to do." A soft sound interrupted them. A shuffle from the hallway. Caleb's heart sank. The girls. They stood frozen by the corner, all 3 still in pajamas. Mira clutched Nora's hand tightly. Their wide eyes were locked on Vivien, who now stood fully exposed. Villia stiffened. For a moment something ugly flashed across her face. Anger. Contempt. But then, as if remembering herself, she straightened and pasted a cold, emotionless smile across her lips. "So," she said bitterly, "this is what you've chosen. Street rats over me?" Caleb moved instinctively, stepping between her and the girls. "You don't speak to them," he said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut stone. Vivien laughed dryly. "Do you think you're some kind of hero? Do you really believe you can play father to them? You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Caleb's jaw tightened. "No, Vivien, you're the one who doesn't know. I'm not like you. I don't walk away." Her eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." He shook his head. "No, the only regret I have is not seeing you for who you truly are sooner." Vivien stood for a moment longer, staring at him, then at the children, her gaze like ice against their fragile faces. Then, without another word, she turned sharply and walked toward the door. Her voice echoed one final time as she pulled it open. "You're a fool, Caleb Mercer." The door closed behind her with a soft but definitive click. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Caleb turned toward the girls slowly, his chest aching as he took in their tear-streaked faces. Mira wiped at her eyes, trying not to cry. Is she coming back?" Mira whispered. No," Caleb said gently, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's not coming back. Ever." The 3 girls moved in unison, their small frames collapsing into his arms. Caleb knelt, holding all 3 as tightly as he could, feeling their tiny hands clutch his shoulders, his neck, his shirt. "You're safe," he whispered into their hair. "You're safe now, I promise." And for the first time in a long time, they believed him. Chapter 8. Aunt Marianne. The rain had stopped. For the first time in weeks, Manhattan woke under clear skies, sunlight spilling between skyscrapers like hope slipping through cracks in stone. Inside Caleb's penthouse, everything felt different now. The storm with Vivien was over, but Caleb knew this was only the beginning. The girls were adjusting, slowly, bravely. The tension in their shoulders had softened, their laughter came more easily, and their voices filled rooms once empty. Yet beneath every smile, he saw what lingered: uncertainty. They were safe for now, but what came next? He needed to give them more than safety. He needed to give them stability. Richard arrived that morning, bringing news that Caleb wasn't sure he was ready for. In Caleb's study, Richard laid a slim file on the polished desk. "We found someone," he said quietly. "Her name is Marianne Whitlow, Thomas's sister." Caleb's brows lifted. "Thomas never mentioned a sister," Caleb said, almost to himself. They were estranged for many years. According to the limited family records, they had a falling out after their parents passed. Haven't spoken in over a decade. Richard exhaled softly. She didn't even know about the triplets. Caleb absorbed that for a moment. And she's alive, stable? Richard nodded. Professor of literature at Oak Ridge State University, owns her home, no criminal record, financially secure, no children of her own. Single, mid-40s. Caleb flipped through the photos Richard provided. Marianne looked nothing like Vivien. She had soft features, kind eyes, her brother's gentle smile. In one picture, she was standing in front of ivy-covered stone buildings on campus, holding a stack of books. "She wants to meet them," Caleb asked, though the answer was already written in Richard's calm expression. "Very much," Richard confirmed. "She was devastated when we contacted her. She had no idea any of this happened." Caleb closed the file gently, his fingers pressing against its cover as his thoughts tangled inside him. He wanted what was best for the girls. And maybe, just maybe, this was it. But the thought of letting them go? That part twisted something deep inside his chest. The next day, Caleb set the girls down in the living room. No television, no distractions, only truth. They sat cross-legged on the couch, shoulder to shoulder as always, watching him with those wide, matching eyes. "I have something important to tell you," Caleb began, his voice steady but gentle. Nora's small brows knit together instantly. She was always the first to brace herself for bad news. Caleb continued, "You have an aunt, your father's sister. Her name is Marianne." The girls stared at him in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. "She didn't know about you before," he explained. "Your dad and her had some differences years ago, but now that she knows, she wants to meet you." "She's our dad's sister?" June finally whispered. "Yes," Caleb nodded. "Is she like Vivien?" Mira asked quietly, her voice trembling. Caleb's heart cracked at the question. "No," he said firmly. "She's nothing like Vivien. I've spoken with her. She wants to know you. She wants to be part of your life. But only if you want that too." "Does she want to take us away?" Nora asked, always direct. Caleb met her gaze, steady and honest. "I don't know yet. Right now she only wants to meet you. That's all." The girls looked at one another, silent words passing between them in that way only they understood. Finally, Nora spoke for them all. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll meet her." The following afternoon, Caleb arranged the meeting at a small cafe just blocks from the penthouse. A neutral place, warm and quiet, where the girls would feel safe. When they arrived, Marianne was already there, sitting nervously at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. She stood when she saw them. Her eyes shimmered instantly, overwhelmed by the sight of the three identical girls standing before her for the very first time. "My God," she breathed, voice breaking. "You're real." The girls clung close together, uncertain, evaluating her. Marianne knelt slowly to their level, her voice warm but not overbearing. "I know I'm a stranger," she whispered, "but you are not strangers to me. You're my family." The girls watched her, studying her face for signs of danger or deceit. "May I sit?" Marianne asked softly. Nora gave the smallest nod. They all sat together at the table, Caleb close by, watching silently but attentively, ready to step in if needed. Marianne reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Your dad and I grew up together," she said. We didn't speak for a long time, but I still have these." She spread out a handful of old photographs on the table. In them were images of Thomas as a young boy sitting beneath tall trees, riding a bicycle, reading under the porch. "That's him," Mira whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. June traced her small fingers across one of the photos. "And smiled like that with us." Gio smiled like that, Marianne whispered, her own tears welling now. "You look so much like him." The girls stared at the pictures, absorbing pieces of a father they had lost too soon, a history they were never told. For the first time since the meeting began, Nora leaned forward. "Why didn't you know about us?" Marianne's face filled with sorrow. "Because I wasn't there when I should have been," she admitted honestly. "Your dad and I argued a long time ago over something that didn't matter. We were both stubborn. And then years went by, and when I finally tried to reach out again, he was gone." She wiped her eyes quickly, trying not to overwhelm them. "I can't change that," she whispered, "but I would like to change now, if you'll let me." The girls exchanged another glance, their unspoken language once again passing silently between them. Finally, Nora said softly but firmly, "We can try." As they stood to leave, Mira reached for Mion's hand for the very first time. Marianne's eyes filled instantly. "I promise," she whispered. "I will never leave you." Caleb watched it all, both comforted and aching in equal measure. They were finally finding family again. But soon, a decision would have to be made, one that would change everything. Chapter 9, The New Beginning. Weeks passed, but the weight of the coming decision never left the air. The girls had begun visiting Marianne regularly, sometimes spending entire weekends in Oak Ridge. Each time they returned to Caleb's penthouse, they carried a little more of her world with them. Stories of their father's childhood, tales of the garden Marianne had started, small trinkets she gave them, a seashell, a pressed flower, a book of bedtime poems their father had loved. Their bond was growing, and so was Caleb's quiet ache. One evening, while the girls were visiting Marianne for a few days, Caleb sat alone in his penthouse. For the first time in weeks, the apartment was silent again. But it no longer felt like peace. The silence wasn't stillness anymore. It was absence. Richard arrived the next morning with coffee in hand, his expression measured as always. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, setting the cup on the table. Caleb offered a tired smile. "Didn't." He rubbed his eyes and exhaled. "I know what's coming, Richard. I know where this leads." Richard nodded, sitting across from him. "They have family, blood." Caleb stared out the window for a moment. "And they deserve that. You've done more for them than anyone ever would have expected," Richard said carefully. "But long-term," he paused, choosing his words delicately. "Marianne offers them something you can't. A permanent family, a real history, a connection to where they came from." Caleb's chest tightened. He knew Richard was right. "That didn't make it easier. I just—" Caleb's voice trailed, rare vulnerability cracking his usual composure. "I don't want them to feel like I'm letting them go. Like I'm abandoning them the way Vivien did." "You're not," Richard said firmly. "And they know that, because you were the one who showed up when no one else did." Later that afternoon, the girls returned. They came through the front door as always, their small footsteps padding across the marble floors. But there was a new confidence in their steps, a comfort in how they carried themselves. Caleb knelt to greet them as they entered. "How was the trip?" he asked, smiling. "Good," Mira chirped. "Aunt Marianne planted a rose bush for each of us. And we started painting our room," June added. "It's blue." Caleb's smile remained steady, but his heart squeezed. Nora stood quietly, watching him, as always reading between words. She knew what was coming, too. That evening, after dinner, Caleb gathered them in the living room. The lights were low, the city sparkling behind them like 1,000 tiny suns. He didn't want this moment to come, but it had to. He sat across from them, his hands folded. "I want to talk to you girls about something important," he began softly. The triplets fell instantly quiet. "You know I love having you here," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "You've made this house feel like something it's never been before. A home." The girls watched him closely, their expressions sober. "You've met your Aunt Marianne," he continued, "and she loves you. She wants to give you a home too, one that connects you to your dad, to your family." June's lip trembled, but she said nothing. Caleb forced himself to stay steady. "I want you to know, this is your choice. No one will ever force you. You decide what feels right." Nora's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" The question pierced deeper than any he'd prepared for. Caleb swallowed. "I want you to be happy, I want you to be safe, and I want you to feel like you belong." He looked at each of them. "If that's here, then I'll fight for that. If it's with your aunt, I'll support that too. What matters most to me is you." The silence stretched. Finally, Nora turned to her sisters. They shared that same wordless exchange they always did. Glances, small nods, unspoken agreement. Nora looked back at Caleb. "We love you," she said simply. "You saved us, but we want to try living with Aunt Marianne." "Ah," Archer replied. "Aunt Marianne." Caleb smiled, his eyes burning. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Mira immediately ran into his arms, her tiny frame clutching his neck. "You'll still visit, right?" Caleb squeezed her gently. "Every chance I get." June and Nora joined the embrace, all four of them holding each other tightly. "You'll always have me," Caleb whispered through the lump in his throat. "Always." The day of their move came faster than he was ready for. The triplets packed their small suitcases, carefully selecting which toys and books to bring, which drawings to leave behind for Caleb to keep. Sandra arrived that morning to help, her eyes red as she folded their clothes. "You okay?" she whispered to Caleb. He smiled faintly. "No. But I will be." At the door, as Marianne waited patiently, the triplets turned back one last time. Nora stepped forward. "You changed our lives," she said softly. Caleb knelt again, looking up at them. "You changed mine," he replied. And then, with one final group hug, they stepped into the elevator. Caleb stood at the threshold, watching the doors slide shut. The silence that followed was deafening. But as the elevator descended, he felt something else underneath the ache. Something like peace. Because love, he realized, isn't possession. It's choosing what's best for them, even when it breaks your heart. Chapter 10, The Goodbye That Saved Them All. Spring settled gently over Oak Ridge. The sky was a perfect watercolor of soft blues and blooming dogwoods as Caleb pulled his car into the quiet neighborhood. The small town stood in sharp contrast to his towering Manhattan skyline. Slower, simpler, and somehow heavier today. It had been nearly 6 weeks since the girls had moved in with Marianne. Since then, Caleb had visited every weekend. At first it was awkward, all of them trying to adjust to the new rhythm. But soon their visits became something steady. Not out of obligation, out of love. As he stepped onto Marianne's porch that morning, he could already hear faint giggles from inside. Mira's unmistakable high-pitched laughter, followed by June's teasing voice and Nora's patient correction. The door opened before he could knock. Vivien smiled warmly. "They've been watching for your car since breakfast." Caleb chuckled. "I might have bribed them with homemade brownies." Marianne laughed softly, stepping aside to let him in. "You didn't have to, but I'm glad you did." Inside, the house had become alive with their presence. A far cry from the sterile apartment Vivien once tried to decorate. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, books stacked on the coffee table, and tiny shoes by the door. It smelled like cinnamon rolls. It smelled like home. The triplets burst into the living room as soon as they spotted him. "Caleb!" Mira squealed, flying into his arms first, followed closely by June and then Nora, who hugged him, with her usual quiet strength. "Miss me already?" Caleb teased, pretending to stumble under their weight. "Every day," June grinned. "We made you something," Nora said quickly, her eyes shining. "Wait here." The three rushed down the hall, whispering excitedly. Caleb exchanged a glance with Marianne, who was already watching him with that knowing, maternal expression. "You've given them more than you realize," she said softly. Caleb smiled, but there was a bittersweet ache behind it. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Marianne said gently. "You did what most people wouldn't." The girls returned a moment later, carefully carrying a small wooden frame wrapped in tissue paper. "For you," Mira said proudly. Caleb carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a simple collage, 3 hand-drawn portraits of them, with a single line written in Nora's careful handwriting. Family isn't who you're born to, it's who shows up. Caleb's throat tightened instantly. He blinked against the sting in his eyes. It's perfect, he whispered. Just like you. They spent the afternoon playing board games, planting seeds in the garden, and reading books beneath the old oak tree in the yard. But as the sun began to dip, painting the sky with soft gold and lavender, Caleb knew it was time. The goodbyes were never easy. But today, it was different. Today was a transition. Today was closure. As they stood by the front porch, Nora spoke first. You'll still come, right? Caleb crouched to their level, his hands resting gently on their small shoulders. Always, he promised. Whenever you want me here, I'll be here. And one day, June added, you'll bring your family too? Caleb smiled faintly at her innocence. Maybe I will. Mira's voice was quieter, more fragile. You're not leaving forever, are you? No, he said softly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. I will always be part of your story, and you'll always be part of mine. They hugged one final time, long and tight, the kind of embrace you give when words aren't enough. As Caleb walked back toward his car, Marianne followed him to the edge of the driveway. You'll visit any time, she said, kindly. He nodded, turning to look back one last time at the house, at the girls waving through the window. I will, he promised. Take care of them. I will, she whispered. And thank you for saving them when I didn't even know they needed saving. Caleb's smile wavered as the weight of her words settled in. Sometimes, he said softly, we save each other. As his car disappeared down the quiet street, Caleb felt both lighter and heavier at once. The apartment in Manhattan would feel empty again, but his heart would not. Because somewhere along this journey, he had learned something that money, power, and success could never teach him. That the purest kind of love isn't measured by how long you hold on, but by how bravely you're willing to let go. The city never stopped for anyone. Back in Manhattan, Caleb sat by the massive windows of his penthouse, staring out over the skyline. The towers stood as silent monuments to his success, the empire he had spent years building, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, none of it mattered. The apartment was still clean, still quiet, but the silence no longer suffocated him. The echo of children's laughter no longer haunted these walls. Because he had learned something far more powerful. He had not lost them. He had simply let them go where they were meant to be. On the coffee table sat the wooden frame they had made for him. Family isn't who you're born to, it's who shows up. Caleb ran his fingertips over the simple words, feeling the faint grooves beneath his hand. He smiled softly, the ache in his chest no longer sharp, but warm. The kind of ache that stays with you because it belongs there. In the distance, his phone buzzed with a photo Marianne had just sent. The girls were outside in Marianne's garden, planting spring flowers beneath the sun. Nora in her usual careful focus, June beaming with her hands covered in soil, Mira laughing under a wide, floppy hat too big for her tiny head. Safe. Whole. And though he wasn't there physically, he was present in every moment. He was part of their story. He always would be. We spend our lives chasing things, success, comfort, perfection, believing they will make us whole. But sometimes life brings us something unexpected. Something small, something fragile, something that tests who we are beneath everything we've built. Love is not about possession. It's not about control or guarantees. Real love, the kind that endures, is a choice. It is choosing to show up even when it costs you. It is choosing to protect even when no one asks you to. And sometimes, it is choosing to let go simply because it's what's best for them, not for you. That, in the end, is where healing begins. If you've ever had to make the hardest kind of choice for someone you love, not for your happiness but for theirs, you know what real love feels like. And if you believe that sometimes letting go is the most powerful act of love, share this story with someone who might need that reminder. Because in a world chasing perfect endings, it's these quiet, imperfect sacrifices that define who we really are.